Hi students, I am Dr Anurag Agarwal and this is OSN Academy of English since 1998. Today, it is a great opportunity, students, that I am going to take a lecture on Unit 2, that is Poetry, which will be benefiting all the English literature scholars for BA, MA, IGNOU, IES Mains, PCS Mains, DSSB, PGT and even UGC NET exams. Students, I am sure you must be very much aware of the sublime beauty in the lines of the classic poems written by the great poets like Harivansh Rai Bachchan's Madhushala and John Keats' Ode to the Nightingale. So we have to also understand that why these poems are so beautiful and so sublime. Do you understand the word sublime? What is the meaning of the word sublime? It means a thing which pleases all and pleases always through the ages and ages. So that is called poetry. And poetry, we all know, is created with one of the most attentive instances of our mind, and that may be primary or secondary imagination. We have already read this primary and secondary imagination in our post-graduation. And its appeal. Why it's appealing? Because most of the poems are meant to be read by the others. Poetry also expresses emotion, and a lot of writing forms to express emotion, passion, but with poetry. And with poetry, it goes into the deeper depth of it. Poetry seems to bring more emotion out of it. And that is why when a poet is writing poetry, he or she has to take care of many reasons why it is considered to be one of the favorite genres by every author. And yes, poetry can mean anything. With such minimal writing, the words can mean anything. Means students कि कितने कम शब्दों में, कितने epigrammatic style में, condensed narration में, there are so many thoughts which are blended into one, and one person can have one perspective of that poetry, and even he can think other things as well, something which is completely different. And poetry also plays on words, it plays on sounds, and it is amazing and how intricate the words and the sounds can flow in a piece of poetry. So that is something which is very natural, very natural. Now we will also discuss what is the status of poetry in today's era, in the today's modern contemporary civilization or era. See students, poetry is admired even today as it was admired long back in the medieval ages, in the ancient times. We all know that the digital age is booming, and that means that attentions are shrinking and the focus is altering. It is true. With few character communication on Twitter and social media, picture and visual postings on social media, and even the classrooms, favoriting the easy reading and escaping the classic works of poetry, poetry has become one of the most you can say underestimated mediums in the modern world and culture, which it used to have in the ancient times, or you can say in the previous decades. In ancient times, what was poetry? Poetry was very near to God. And poetry, according to Philip Sidney, is an art of imitation. And this art of imitation representing, counterfeiting or figuring forth to speak you can say metaphorically a speaking picture, to teach and to delight. Means it gives a beautiful sense of delight, and it gives a happiness, feeling of happiness to teach. And if we talk about the words of Wordsworth, in the words of Wordsworth, what is that which has to be discussed here? What is the definition of poetry? Poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings taking its origin from, you can say, the undercurrents, what is in our mind. And poetry is an art that it is written or spoken in a rhythmical composition. Rhythms hota hai students. And yes, the purpose of poetry is to entertain by creating a beautiful and imaginative thought. And this imaginative and beautiful thought has to be understood properly by students. There are many different types and forms of poetry which varies with the repetition, which varies with rhyming, and two popular subjects often used in poetry are nature and feelings. This is very important. Now, there are three types of poetry students. पहला होता है आपका नैरेटिव, दूसरा होता है लिरिक पोइट्री, एंड द थर्ड इज ड्रामेटिक पोइट्री. Narrative poetry, lyric poetry, and dramatic poetry. We can say that if we talk about the narrative poetry, the sub-contents which come in the narrative poetry are: the first is epic, the second is the ballad, then we have the monologues, then we have the tales, then we can say we have the metrical romances. And if we talk about the lyrics, we have the elegy, we have the ode, and yes, last but not least, the most important and the most popular is sonnet writing, the 14-line composition. Now, the dramatic type of poetry, इसमें क्या होता है students? इसमें आपके बहुत सारे होते हैं, जैसे tragedy, comedy, tragicomedy, then we have the drama, then we have the mask, and so many other things as well. Now, when we come to narrative poetry is basically a story with a plot and characters, and even it has a setting. The loftiest form, जो सबसे magnitude epical form होता है, उसको कहते हैं epic. And this epical form, जैसे Paradise Lost है, which deals with the gods, which deals with the heroes, majestic, they are both majestic in theme and style, is a long narrative poem about the feasts of gods and heroes. Epics basically deal with the legendary and the historical events of the national or the universal significance, involving action of grandeur and sublimity. Fine. Most epics deal with the exploits of a single individual, and by this they give unity to the composition. Composition में एक unity आ जाती है इसके वजह से. और typically अगर हम कहें, typically एक epic जो है उसके अंदर बहुत सारे features होते हैं. There are several features which are there in an epic. That is conflict in the form of battles or other physical combat, stylistic conventions such as an invocation to the muse, as we even see in the Paradise Lost, a formal statement of the theme, long lists of the protagonists who are involved in that epic, and yes, set speeches, which is basically couched in a very elevated, very sublime language that gives grandeur and makes a poetry look like an epic. Fine. Then English literature. In English literature we find but one poem truly deserving, which I have just told you, that is John Milton's Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and there are others as well, and Milton's Paradise Lost talks about the universality, and that is why it is a epic which is unsurpassed if compared to the other ancient epics of the past. Now, what is metrical romance? Metrical romance students क्या आप समझते हैं? This is basically a narrative poetry which is a fairy lore, and it appears as the theatrical romance. इसका जो form होता है वो थोड़ा simple होता है. Its form is little simple, and it comprises the story of a life in ordinary circumstances and is generally termed metrical tales. Now, there is a term known as ballad. These things are very important students. Why? Because whenever we start any unit, These basic descriptions are very important. Otherwise, how will you understand that यहाँ से लेके शुरुआत हम लोग करेंगे और यहाँ तक हमें पहुँचना है. So to make this, you have to understand the deeper instincts and the basics of literature. So ballad क्या होता है basically students? That is the briefest form in a single incident from a life is called a ballad. And it is basically a song like narrative with stanzas. बहुत सारे stanzas होते हैं. And these stanzas are known for its refrain. Now you will ask, sir, what is a refrain? Refrain वो होता है जहाँ पे हर स्टैंजा की जो लास्ट लाइन है वो हर स्टैंजा के लास्ट लाइन से मैच करती है. एंड दैट इज बिकॉज टू ऐड द ब्यूटी, टू ऐड द मेलोडी इन द पोएम. एंड मोस्ट ऑफ द फैसिनेटिंग टेल्स आर इन द फॉर्म ऑफ बैलेड्स. If I talk about the 18th century, students, when there was a revival of interest in the earlier times, the ballad, which were admired due to their simplicity, due to their wonderful dramatic power. And yes, the best example can be no better than S.T. Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So this was a great example of ballad, and to understand ballad, I hope you must have understood. Now we move further to understand that what is lyric poetry. Lyric poetry is a very simple poem, a short poem, which is highly musical also in verse, undoubtedly, that conveys powerful feelings, powerful emotions. And in this lyric, the poet may use rhyme, meter, or other literary devices as well to give them an air of song-like quality. It is unlike narrative poetry which chronicles the events. Lyric poetry does not have to tell a story. A lyric poem is a private expression of emotion by a single speaker. For example, the best example I can take is you must have read in American literature Emily Dickinson's poems. So Emily Dickinson is very famous for his lyrical poems, though innumerable authors have written lyrical poems. Lyric poem also falls into 4 classes. And what are these 4 classes, students? I will tell you. Songs, then elegies, then odes, and the last sonnets. 4 प्रकार के lyrics होते हैं students. Songs, elegies, odes, and sonnets. And these express the feelings of a single speaker. Lyrics are the most common type of poem even in our modern contemporary literature. Now, if I talk about the elegies, lyric poetry की अगर हम और बात करें तो elegies and odes have elaborate in structure. They are elaborate in structure and weighty in subject. इसका मतलब ये होता है स्टूडेंट्स कि जो एलिजीज जो लिखते हैं, जो ओड्स लिखते हैं, उनका जो सब्जेक्ट मैटर होता है वो लिरिक मैटर से काफ़ी अलग होता है और उसके अंदर काफ़ी वेट होता है. इट इज़ क्वाइट वेटी इन कंपैरिजन टू द लिरिक्स. एंड द फॉर्मर डील्स विद, जैसे एलिजी की बात करें, इट डील्स विद डेथ ईदर इन द जनरल और एज you can say any particular individual, and the latter are usually in praise of some person or some praise of something. And the elegy, which is commonly defined as meditative poem or sorrowful theme. कैसी poem students? Meditative poem. और कैसी theme होगी? Sorrowful theme होगी, usually lamenting the dead person. And it is well represented in many poems like Milton's Lycidas, Thomas Gray elegy written in a country churchyard. Fine. So now we will go to understand dramatic poetry as well. Now what is dramatic poetry, students? Dramatic poetry falls into 2 great classes of tragedy and comedy, which is supplemented by the minor variations of farce, minor variations of masque, morality play, miracle play, mystery play, even the interludes and even the opera. इतनी सारी चीज़ों का समावेश होता है इसमें. And dramatic poetry tells a story using a character's own thoughts or spoken sentence, statement. Now, you have to also note down some of the important points about poetry, because we are studying the unit 2, that is poetry. See, the first is that in poetry, the sounds and the meanings of the words are combined to form the thoughts, to combine to form the ideas, the feelings and the emotions. Poetry is usually written in lines, and the various elements of poetry are rhythm, sound, imagery, forms and types. Then classic poems, you must have heard the name of classic. Classic poems shows images which leave the readers awestruck. And why the readers are awestruck? Because of its wonderful, passionate beauty which strikes to our eyes, to our senses too. And poetry is a literary attempt to share the personal experiences and feelings. Suppose I have experiences which I want to share, then poetry is the best medium for it. And poetry also requires creativity. It also requires a lot of emotion in your heart. It also requires artistic essence and even logic. Logic is very important. Now, my question to you students is that how to cover poetry or how to cover unit 2, that is poetry, in the UGC NET exam. Though it is a topic, it is an area where there is no full stop, comma and there is no end to it. You must be thinking, students, that there is a lot about this unit in the syllabus. Innumerable authors, what to study, what not to study. And this unit is thereby very vast, and it requires a lot of time, lot of patience, lot of hard work, lot of study, and lot of study which requires, an experienced mentor as well. So here, as a mentor will guide you that how you have to study. See, unit 2, that is poetry, deals with the poetry from the beginning of the 14th century to the modern era. Poetry of American literature, Afro-American literature, Australian literature and even Indian literature, to name a few. So we begin with the age of Chaucer, that is the British literature, and we end with the modern poetry. Now, the actual question arises. What is this actual question, students? Are you supposed to study the entire Canterbury Tales, or the entire Wasteland, or the entire, Paradise Lost line by line, or Spenser's Epithalamium line by line, or Ulysses, or so many poems which are so big? The answer is yes and no, both. We cannot say yes, we cannot say no. So, how you have to study unit 2 in this NET exam? Students usually ask me that how to study and prepare notes for unit 2. So here I am going to discuss some of the tricks and techniques you can utilize to study this unit. Fine. So learning the definitions of poetry and to understand its forms and their characteristics. Then you divide the poets age-wise, and then the category of the major poets on the one hand side and the minor poets on the other hand side. And it is very well defined in my own original study materials, which is taken by the students pan India, and my course of the video classes as well, where I will be describing the new authors as well from time to time, and I keep my courses upgraded for every examination. You have to study all the major poets of the age, of every age. For example, you can talk about this Chaucer in the 14th century, Shakespeare's sonnets, Edmund Spenser's poetry, Philip Sidney's poetry, John Milton in the 17th century, Alexander Pope in the neoclassical age, Wordsworth, Keats, Shelley, Coleridge, Byron, followed by Arnold, Browning, Eliot and W. Yeats in the Victorian, the post-era Victorian, the modern age as well, and many more in the postmodern age too. And when you study a major poet, remember you have to study each and important event that took place in his life. and which may or may not have inspired him to write that particular poem. This incident may be a loss, may be a happy moment, may be a national event in his age or in his era. So each and every single event from his birth to death is important to study, and that is where that mentorship is required, because you have so much content on Wikipedia, on the books, that it is impossible for a student to filtrate those things which is needed for the UGC NET exam. And when you study a minor poet, you need to remember his important works, and then you can remember his important minor works too. You never think that way, that this is a minor poet, I can leave it, and this is a major, I should do it. No, it can be vice versa also. And you have to keep practicing the questions which are based on the particular poets and their major and the minor writers, as everything has to be counted in particular in your nourishment area, that is your subconscious, because you never know that which question is about to come and which question has to be entertained by your subconscious to make your options filled, that 4 options which comes to your mind. So the more nourishment you have, the more fertility you have, the more nurturing you will be having with my classes, with my study materials, with my online test series, and so. I am sure you will also become one of those champions which students past 23 years have been becoming assistant professors and professors all over the country. So with this, students, I hope that you must have liked this lecture too much, and if you wish to join the regular classes, the entire course content from Unit 1 to Unit 10, you may talk to me, you may WhatsApp me, you may comment on the box, and you may contact for all the details. Fine. Thank you so much, students.